it is painful to identify as an ego. It's such a small split off part of the whole. So we're going to talk about basically part 2 of the topic of forgiveness, with a focus on self-forgiveness and our relation to ourselves. Yeah. So I'll just start with a kind of a minor incident that just helped me understand a little bit more of my relation to myself. So recently I had a task. It's kind of complicated. You can probably cut a lot of this out, but I'm on the executive committee for a nonprofit society that studies psychology as the discipline of interiority, which is Wolfgang Giegerich psychology. And as on the executive committee, I'm the treasurer. And so I keep a database of all the members and their dues, and like when they need to up their membership, renew their membership, and when it's lapsed, and blah, blah, blah. So we decided to send out an email, a blanket email to our membership whose memberships have expired, and just say, hey, we noticed you've expired, if you renew, these are your benefits. So we're just trying to get them to renew. And when we sent out the email, a couple people wrote back and say, hey, my membership hasn't expired. What are you doing? What do you mean? Right? This is a mistake. And I realized I had missed them in the database. I hadn't updated their information. So I just missed a couple. So I wrote an email to the group, and it wasn't a big deal, but it was like, oh gosh, I'm sorry, my bad. I somehow missed this. Please send an email with my apologies. I told the president to do that. And then another member of the executive committee said, well, it's no big deal. It's, let me just actually tell you what he wrote, because I thought it's just a one-liner, but it made me realize the extent to which I don't think the way he does. And I was like, oh, let's see if I should have had this ready to go. Cut all this out, please. So, let's see. Okay, he said, I had said, okay, I found their payments and updated the spreadsheet accordingly. I've tried to stay on top of it and hope these are the only ones I've missed. So that was my email out, right? And then he says, I think it's fine. It's this sort of process that finds the gaps, and all they suffered was an email. Right? And I was like, oh. Right? Like what? And it was just so helpful to sort of get that angle, like, it's no big deal, really, and it was just, he could see objectively at the situation, and I was looking subjectively, like and I was apologizing, and, and it was just very, very helpful to kind of get that reflection. And I was thinking, wow, that's such in a way, if we were to kind of be that objective view for our patients, and kind of, in a sense, be grounded in reality when they're maybe in in some kind of distortion to reality, how helpful that can be. Just a simple reflection that. So that was very helpful, and that's my little story to kick us off. And I guess I'll just say one more thing. Even though the topic is self-forgiveness, I think it really it is tied to our relation to ourselves, and I think also to our identification with the ego self. Because even in that example, where I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, what I'm doing in that moment, I'm defending Jennifer. I'm defending my persona, like my self-construct. And when someone doesn't have to defend that, they see clearly the case. But in my own defense of Jennifer, or my wanting her to like be responsible or look good or promise I won't do it again or blah, 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 it's taking me out of my being, my present moment awareness, and into this sort of hooked up version of myself that's really doesn't have a lot to do with the I. So, and then also having so much generosity for the poor little ego that's like, oh no, right? Like, and just go, not judging it. Yeah. Okay, I have one more story for you, and then I'll turn it over to you. So I had a friend visit over the weekend. I don't think she'll care if this story gets out into the ether. But she was talking about this experience she had where she sort of lost her temper and started yelling at her dog. And just to the point where she was screaming at the dog. And I know her. She can do that. She can really, like, when she's mad, she's mad. And so she's telling the story how she just lost it, and she's screaming at the dog, and the dog's like shaking, and the cat attacks her to protect the dog from her. Yeah. Wow. And we were like, wow, and laughing, and she was laughing, and I'd actually heard the story before, but this time when she was telling, because she was telling my mom the story too, what I really appreciated was that she was able to observe her ego and laugh, right? And I thought, that's amazing, because I was thinking, gosh, if I was judging her, my ego was judging her ego. Oh, how awful of you to be so mean to your dog, or whatever. Or like, how could you just blah, 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 right? So that's my ego judging, which is, thankfully, it's kind of in the back. It's sort of like in the peanut gallery at this point in my life, for the most part. But, and I just so appreciated her ability to like look at her ego and laugh at it. And that felt very liberating. And it feels to me like an aspirational goal, I think, to be able to relate to that, because our egos are going to freak out. I mean, they're going to get constantly triggered and reactive. It's all old debris. It's autonomous. The ego, it's just reactive. It's traumatized. It's going to get triggered. It's going to judge, all of that stuff. But it's when we can notice it with a kind of generosity, that we're really free, right? So those were my two little stories about self-relation that I thought would be helpful.
I'm glad you pointed out how, like, in this last story, you were talking about, like, your own ego kind of being judging in the moment. And as you were telling the story, I'm like, oh yeah, I think I was doing that too. Like, oh my gosh, she was yelling at her dog. No wonder the cat attacked. Like that kind of thing. But in like to bring it back to how does that reflect my own self relation? I feel like that's a good example of like how I can also get hooked into my own ego and be constantly kind of judging myself, and it being hard to really have that separation or that objectivity, that you're talking about. Yeah, it's, I mean, like the more and more I think about it, it's like, it's so hard to kind of disidentify with the ego. Because for so long you feel like that's me, that's I, and if it's like if it creates some kind of distorted version or vision of yourself, then it can be scary, at least for me, I think, to disidentify, because then then you end up wondering the question, well, who am I? But I'm guessing that would be just the ego's question also. Like, because the self would just be and, be okay with that. But yeah. So that's where your stories have, I guess, kind of took me a little bit.
When you bring up identification with the ego and forgiveness, it makes me think of being a father and how, on one hand, on one plane, if I identify with my ego and I'm in a complex or I'm going through some sort of obsessive thought and I'm attacking myself, I haven't really integrated or forgiven myself for whatever it is that I'm attacking myself for. Whatever that may be, whatever trauma that may be that was given to me as a child, don't do this, don't do that. And, you continually do it. And then as a father, I find if I don't take care of that part of myself and my children do that, which I attack myself for doing, I then lash out at them. Now, I'm not like, 1970s parents like it was back then. I'm more annoyed or irritated, but it is very difficult. And this is something that I try to bring up with, let's say, with parents where, they're so irritated with their children if they're making too much noise or doing X, Y, and Z. And it's always like, what internal child is trying to hide from the parent? So if I got yelled at for doing something, when I was a kid, I will tend to then be on high alert when my children are doing it. And it just keeps going and going and going. So it just made me think of I am and, the ego versus the self, and how we truly have to understand that when we're parents. And unfortunately, that's not something that any parent really is told or given unless they go see a psychologist or a depth psychologist, or they seek help. But yeah, just piggybacking off of you said about the self and the I am.
I totally appreciate what you're saying, because I think too, one of the things we also find are grown children really annoyed with their parents, their adult parents, as if we still need them to be a certain way for us, even as adults. we don't need a parent anymore, but we're still annoyed when they're not a certain way, when they're not the way we want. There's a demand for them to be. And I think that it is the ego, it is this other identity, really, which is an ego identity that is very young. The ego is kind of cooked and baked around 11, 12, maybe. You're sort of who you are by that time. I mean, there's some development, subtle changes and shifts, but so when we kind of operate from the ego, we're kind of still in this kid-like relation, even though we're in adult bodies. And it can be kind of funny too to notice, like, if I can notice that in myself, like if I get annoyed with my 82-year-old mother, what am I doing, right? But it's it's still always in the background, right? Because you can't ever really. I think it's important not to try to fix the ego, because then we have what we call holy ego syndrome. So I'm going to be a holy ego. I'm going to be good all the time. I'm not going to get triggered. I'm not going to, it's investing so much of our time. When we try to fix that, we're investing so much time into this dead structure that's unconscious, and it really can't learn. We can probably do some minor improvements over time, but they're just cosmetic. It's much better, I think, more helpful to I like what you said, Karina, unhook, sort of disengage, sort of step away from, like peel away, or just sort of relativize the ego so that we can observe it. And even, in a sense, be kind, because that really is, in a way, sort of the young part of ourselves. Versus bat it away or be ashamed of it or abandon it, or, like.
It was interesting because this week, like, I could hear it happening again, and it just felt like there was so much energy that I also felt to, like, help all of us in that space kind of disentangle from the voice. I kept thinking of what you said, Dr. Sandoval, to not believe it so much, and I could feel myself kind of getting pulled into it and, like, believing it. And so I was trying to be more reflective of the process rather than, like, believing what was being said and, like, getting worked up about it. And for some reason it set off my own something about my own ego, where, like, I left that session feeling like just, like, ineffective, or like, here we are again, like, I thought we had, like, created this distance. I'm not doing, maybe I'm not, I'm not doing it right. Or, like, maybe they all see me as this terrible therapist. I'm not looking good, or, those kinds of things. So it's just interesting how it kind of set off a bit of a chain reaction in some way.
Well, I really love that point, though, that you're making. But I think, like, there's this, it is painful to identify as an ego. It's such a small, split off part of the whole. But there's an insistence that and I think sometimes, not just with patients, but with all of us, we insist on being an ego, and we're going to try and be happy as one. But there is no such thing as a happy ego. It's too painful to be so constrained, and then to be known as an ego by other egos. It's just so empty and lonely, and, like, it's just very painful. So I think when we really look to the ego for our identity, and we're going to kind of take up this sort of separate, split off piece, and then we're split off from everybody else, everything else. It's just excruciating. It's very painful. So I think when we can really begin to release that identification, and you begin to just, it's like, there's just, it's almost like sort of the feeling I have, and I think it's probably different for different people, but it just feels like I kind of sort of sink down below thoughts into this kind of still point, just a stillness. And it's so peaceful. And then I look up and I'm present and I'm like, oh, a tree or a kitty cat or a cub. I mean, you don't feel separate anymore when you're in that just present. It's so expansive. It's almost like we just spill out into everything and we feel connected. It's a really wonderful and important, I think, experience. And when people can gain access to that, I mean, I was driving this morning to go to, I had to drive across town to drop the car off or get a part changed. And usually I'll plug in my iPhone and I'll listen to the news or music or something. And for whatever reason, I didn't. And I was just driving and it was so quiet in my car. And I was like, right. Stillness. Right. And it helped me remember. And I think there are lots of opportunities for reminding us, because everyone's really busy and the holidays and all, but just these moments, and we really only have to go there for a moment and it just shifts everything. It doesn't have to be like a 60-minute meditation or something, it really can be very quick to kind of drop in and gain that benefit of like, oh, I'm connected.